that it's okay to be a man.
It's not okay. It's necessary. What the hell are we going to do without men? You look around the city here, you see all these buildings go up. These men, they're doing impossible things. They're under the streets, working on the sewers. They're up on the power lines in the storms and the rain. They're keeping this impossible infrastructure functioning. This thing that works in a miraculous manner. They work themselves to death. And often literally, the gratitude for that is sorely lacking, especially among the people who should be most grateful. You see university professors, especially of the social justice bent, who are among the most protected and privileged people that the world has ever produced. They take everything they have for granted, failing to understand entirely that there's a massive infrastructure of unbelievably hardworking, solidly laboring, working class men breaking themselves in half on a regular basis, making sure that everything that always breaks works. And so a little gratitude for that is in order. And it's very useful to tell everyone, not just men, that they have an important role to play, a necessary role, and that if they act properly and honestly and forthrightly, that they can put their lives together and they can help their families and they can make their communities better, and that's not toxic masculinity, that appalling phrase. It's what keeps the world going round. And if we had any sense, we'd understand that instead of doing everything at every possible moment to label what we have in the West as oppressive and patriarchal and fundamentally predicated on power of all the insane propositions. Anybody who's ever worked for a functional organization knows perfectly well that the organization isn't predicated on power. You have a boss whose fundamental motivation is power. Well, first of all, the probability that he's going to be successful is very low because everyone will be working against him behind the scenes. The people who are successful are good mentors, and they're hard workers, and they're productive, and they're competent, and they do their job properly, and they do everything they can. My observation has been that they do everything they can, and none of that's credited to the oppressive, capitalist, patriarchal system, which also is doing miracles, is performing miraculously all around the world, raising the standard of living of poor people everywhere in the world at a rate that's unprecedented in human history. I don't think men are encouraged. I think they're discouraged actively right from day one. But what I also don't understand, especially from the feminists, is that if the goddamn oppressive male patriarchy is such a hellish structure bent on the oppression and domination of everyone in the world, why in the world are women encouraged to flock into it and occupy all the positions of power? That makes no sense to me at all. Is it supposed to be magically transformed in its oppressive nature merely because women happen to be doing exactly the same jobs that men were? Are the women magical in some sense and are going to decrease the degree to which the oppressiveness occurs? There's no evidence for that. You know that women who have male bosses are happier on average than women who have female bosses. The data, the psychological data on that are quite clear. So there's no evidence that women run more compassionate or efficient organizations than men. And I don't know why you would expect them to, because men and women are more the same than they are different, even though the differences aren't trivial. And the idea that there are no differences between men and women, which is the standard social constructionist line, is only indicative of an ignorance of biology that's so profound that it should be criminal. So there's many differences between men and women, and morphologically, physiologically, psychologically, temperamentally, hormonally, developmentally, right from in utero exposure to different sex hormones. And these are not trivial matters, and they have not a determining effect, but a crucial effect. And you see these especially manifested in the extremes, which is why, for example, that the rates of incarceration of men are 10 to 15 times those of women. That's not sociological. It's because there's a small proportion of men who are hyper-aggressive, and you can identify them when they're 2. So, the social constructionists, Judith Butler and people like that, they know absolutely nothing about biology. Nothing. And their ignorance of biology is so profound that they don't even think that they need to know anything about biology because it's not real. It's all a social construct. And it does no one any good. We know in the Scandinavian countries, here's a statistic. The freer the country, the fewer women in the STEM fields. Now explain that. It's easy. If you allow women their choice, they go into professions that care for people. If you allow men their choice, they go into professions that deal with things. And the freer the society, the more that happens. And so the Scandinavians are in this strange position where they've maximally freed their sexes by introducing socially egalitarian legislation. And one of the fundamental consequences is that the differences between men and women in Scandinavia are bigger than they are anywhere else in the world, both in terms of occupational choice and personality. And the Scandinavians have no idea what to do about that. It was a shock to everyone, including the psychologists who discovered it. But what are we going to do? We're going to force little boys and little girls to be exactly the same? We're going to set up a huge bureaucracy to start to hyper-socialize them when they're tiny, so that they become identical in every way by the time they're adults? You really think that's going to work? You have to be arrogant beyond conception and cruel to think that such a policy would be either viable or reasonably implemented. And yet we read backwards and we say, well, men were privileged. Which bloody men were privileged? Exactly. I mean, let's get down to the nuts and bolts of it. Who were privileged? The serfs who tilled the land? The knights who defended the feudal communities? The kings, perhaps, although I'm not so sure you would have wanted to live in a drafty and freezing castle with no plumbing or electricity or heating or entertainment through ice-cold winters with the constant threat of war. The men went off to war constantly. There were endless numbers of devastating plagues. No one had enough to eat. It's like, and now what are we doing? We're quibbling about whether men or women had a rougher time. It's like, Jesus, And then what? There was no cooperation between men and women? What's that? Men help raise children. Do you know how rare that is in the mammalian community? It's almost unheard of. And they actually do a pretty good job. Most men love their children. And so where's the oppression? Some temporary imbalance in rights. As the idea that universal human suffrage was an appropriate idea slowly manifested itself from about 1500 onward, eradicating slavery, bringing in universal suffrage over a very short period of time. 5 100-year-old men. That's the span of time we're talking about. And now we have this narrative that men were fundamentally oppressing women since the beginning of time.